Today, I'm joined by Noel Gomez, co-founder of DataCoves, where he helps data teams put dbt and Apache Airflow into production without spending months building and stitching together their own platforms from scratch. Noel has spent more than 15 years working on data platforms, and before DataCoves, he worked in enterprise data, including at Amgen. What makes him especially interesting for the show is that he sits right at the intersection of what we care about: modern data tooling, real production constraints, and the messy reality of helping teams actually deliver value with data. Noel, thank you for joining us here on the podcast. So before we dive into the questions, can you tell us something about yourself and your background and how you got here?
For inviting me. I'm happy to join the call here today, the podcast. And how I got here, well, it's one of those strange things. I would say that, so I went to school to be an industrial engineer. And so a lot of the stuff where you learn about lean manufacturing, Toyota production systems, some of those things still carry. I've always been a person who looks for, like, how do you do things right the first time? How do you avoid inefficiency and waste and all of that kind of stuff? And so from that manufacturing background, I eventually got and worked on some software things where I was using Ruby on Rails, the web framework, and that taught me a lot. This was, over 10 years ago. And I learned a lot about having conventions over configuration, where you can essentially look at a project, any Ruby on Rails project, and it will be very similar. And when you're first starting out, you're just following the rules. You don't necessarily know why. You just say, okay, somebody told me to put this here, and that's where I put this stuff. And eventually I appreciated that. I appreciated that, you're teaching good software development best practices without actually knowing that that's what you're doing. Right? It was set up by somebody who had more experience than you, who did all of that stuff. And again, then you appreciate it, but not in the very beginning. And so then when I was at a large enterprise and we were modernizing, this is around the 2017 timeframe, I was wanting to do things with some of those same principles that we had from software engineering. So like convention over configuration and unit testing and data testing and all of these kinds of principles, version control, all of that kind of stuff. And we were using a GUI tool, a traditional enterprise GUI tool, and we were moving more to like Airflow, and we ended up creating our own custom framework. So it's essentially like saying we were making our own dbt, but it didn't live up to what my ideal way of doing this stuff was. And so we eventually developed this thing, deployed it, and it ended up being better than what we had previously, but not meeting my expectations of what could look like. So fast forward to 2019, left the company, started this company, and we started with a different product initially. And it's very similar to what's happening today, because we were doing, this is around 2019, we were doing a product like a voice assistant for sales reps in pharma. And I went into it with the idea that like, everybody has good data and we just have to put this at the end and everything will work out, right? Which is similar to what we're seeing today with Gen AI, where you don't have the governance, you don't have the ownership, you don't have a lot of those processes in place. But I took that for granted back then. And what we were seeing is that you needed that first part. You needed the governance. You needed the ways of working and all of that. And we're doing consulting and helping people set up CI/CD and all of this stuff. And that's when I essentially like ran into or learned about dbt and started using Snowflake. I knew about Snowflake, but hadn't used it. And then it all clicked for me, because I'm like, all the things that I had wanted to do, the software development best practices and all of that, other people had thought about it, and I can see how I can make this all work. What was missing was the glue to connect all of these pieces, because it isn't just a warehouse. I need to think about security for the warehouse. I need to think about security as code. I needed to think about the CI/CD process. I needed to think about how do I do data ingestion and on, right? And also look at things from the enterprise perspective, because you don't just have one way of ingesting data. You may have multiple tools to ingest data. You may have steps that you have to do after the transformation. And so that's where Airflow comes in, because I'm like, okay, you need an orchestrator, an orchestration layer that can communicate with existing tools or new tools and connect the end-to-end process and surface issues and all of that. And then the other problem that we saw was that when you're dealing at scale, even though all of these tools are open source, managing, setting them up, setting up the platform and all of the surrounding processes is not very simple. And especially if you don't have a lot of experience. And so saying I can run Airflow, which we would run into people running Airflow on an EC2 machine, but that doesn't scale very well. So saying like I can run Airflow to saying I can run Airflow on Kubernetes, there's a big gap there. And so that's what we saw, that it's like, okay, you have all of these tools, they're great. You need to connect them all, and you need a platform and a way of doing this stuff. And I guess the final thing is, we were working with people who were dealing with sensitive data, and maybe they didn't want to use a SaaS. And so their alternative was, I'm going to have to build everything myself, because I want it in my cloud account. And so we said, well, what if we made it so we can deploy it in your Kubernetes, in your Azure or your AWS? And so it's like solving for all of those different things. And so a new developer comes in, and in 10 minutes they're ready to go because they didn't have to install anything. And when you upgrade, everybody's on the same version of everything. And it isn't just the same version of DBT, but the same version of SQL Fluff, or the same version of the AWS CLI, or whatever it is. There's multiple components, and you have to make sure that those are in sync between your development environment, your CI/CD environment, your Airflow environment, right? So it's keeping all of that stuff in sync.
So it's really about governance at scale, maybe specifically about the technological part of governance, correct?
Both. It's the technology and the process that goes with it, right? So how do you do all of those things together? So I mentioned Snowflake security, right? So people starting with Snowflake may not know like what's a good way of setting up security model. And then the next piece would be like, how do I do this in a repeatable way? So you'll see people do different kinds of ways of doing security. And a lot of times people just go to a worksheet in Snowsight, and they just type, create role and grant role to user and all of that stuff. Well, how is that repeatable, right? And so, we were thinking about that stuff right from the very beginning. Because again, I'm thinking scale. I'm thinking not when you have 3 people, but when you have 100 people,
Yeah, and it's also like every tool has a very clear boundary of like, this is what we do and this is what we don't do. But that often means that when 2 tools are collaborating, a lot of things fall into nobody's territory when it comes to governance. So it's really nice that you already went ahead with that in mind.
Exactly, because, like I said, DBT to me was great as a framework, as a way to do all those things that I wanted to. But what do you put inside the models folder? There's no convention. There's nothing that says like, do it this way, right? Or do it this way so that when you have, 6,000 DBT models, it's not crazy, right? So I'm thinking in that direction because, again, a lot of people are coming at it from the perspective of like, my project is small, I'm just starting, or the company's small. So they're not thinking 6,000. I'm thinking 6,000 from the very beginning, or multiple thousand. People are thinking 100 or maybe 500 DBT models, right? So the scale difference is there. And like you said, you see this within organizations and across tooling vendors. Everybody just takes care of their piece, right? But what I tell people is, if I'm an organization, it's like saying, I want a chocolate cake. Okay. But what they have is ingredients over here, an oven is over there, a mixer is over there, right? It's like all the pieces are there. but I just want a cake. Like, help me get to a cake as quickly as possible.
I guess with AI penetrating a lot of these enterprises, I'm seeing a couple interesting trends that relate to this sort of business of a data platform and governance. I guess on the one hand, I recall seeing this on Coalesce, that this graph of the amount of users that had a certain amount of DBT models in their projects, and you just see it grow exponentially over time. And this was pre-AI, right? And all I'm imagining now that you can generate this even faster, it's going like asymptotic, right? Like it's not going to be so rare for companies to have thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of DBT models. At the same time, I feel like there's definitely some hubris. Let's say executives in these organizations saying, "Well, we're able to push this volume of models. Why can't we build this capability in house now that we have AI?" Like, where do you feel like data platforms like your own really fit in this picture and sort of steer the conversation into a more wholesome direction?
I think the way I look at it is the basics haven't changed. So I mean, like the same things that I've been talking about for years are still the case today. So if we think about AI as the same thing that happens when you say you have self-service analytics, what you did is you said, I went from, I have a team of people who are very knowledgeable, who can set some standards and all of that, to anybody and everybody can do anything, right? And so what ends up happening, you end up like a billion Power BI dashboards and Tableau and metrics, like duplicated, and there's no ownership, and right. And so we saw that happen, and we said, like, no, you need to shift left. You need to put that logic in a centralized and governed place, et cetera, right? Well, now AI is essentially doing the same thing. It's speeding up what people are creating. And yes, you go from like, you had I don't know, let's say 500 DBT models, so now you could have 5,000 DBT models. But that has a negative, like, did you really need the 5,000 DBT models? Because that's going to increase your costs and your run times, right? And so what I tell people is you still need those guardrails. You still need to have a foundation for AI to work better. I have an example where I remember when we were doing this migration, back in 2017, I used to say, like, we have to name things a certain way. Like, a table, the naming convention for a table has to be a certain way, for a schema, for a database, like everything, like, made sense. And people would like say to me, like, why do we need to do this? You're just being, like, painful to work with, right? Like you're caring about things that don't really matter, because, like, so what if it's called A or B? Well, fast forward later on in that project, we were using notebooks, and we created a Python library where you could reference. So without knowing where the table was, what database or schema, you could just say, like, I want sales data for this product, right? So pass into parameters, and you would just get a data frame back. But then when we got to that, people were like, oh, it's so good that we did that, because it was easy, because we had the naming conventions, right? The tool could now decipher or figure out what the name of the table should be. And so, like, this is what I talk to people about right now, that, when you're talking about, let's say, a security role, a folder and a DBT model, and like a schema in Snowflake, like all of these things, if they all make sense, if you have good naming conventions, then you can connect the dots. And what I tell people is, if a human can connect the dots, then the AI will also be able to connect the dots, right? And if it's hard for a human, it's also hard for the AI, because I've seen things where the same type of data is in a table with very different names. Like the pattern of the table name is different. And I'm like, I can't look at this and tell you what is the difference between these tables because I just can't tell. Like, this is a Salesforce name and this is a product name, and what is the difference? And so, like, if I'm having a hard time figuring it out, the AI will have a hard time figuring it out. And then people will say, well, AI could figure it out, okay, but now you're using tokens and you're spending time. And so, like, all of the stuff we were talking about with, self-service analytics are just exploding, right? And so it's always a balance in my mind. It's like, set up a good foundation, set up the guardrails, the governance, all of that kind of stuff. Then you can move faster and not do it in a way that creates a lot of technical debt.
And what is one thing that people are not talking too much about is working at scale with AI. Before AI, the loop was always you implement a solution, you start experiencing the pain of the solution that you built, kind of like you said, they're having all of the grants in the same file in Snowflake. You look for a solution, you learn, and then you re-implement. And going through that loop enough times allows you to build a product that actually works in scale. I think that with AI, that loop is still kind of happening, but we remove the part where we actually learn.
I think we just accept. I think it's very hard at the scale and at the speed of AI to even validate that AI is doing something right. I have a blog post that I did where I have one of those images where it shows you like the same image left and right, and it tells you find the 3 differences between these 2 images. And so I asked ChatGPT, and it came back and it said, it's A, B, and C. It only had one right. One of the 3 was right. And then it said, would you like me to highlight the things that are different? So I said yes. So what it did is it actually changed the picture. So it hallucinated, changed the picture so that it was right. And I'm like, this is an example of something I can validate because I can see the picture. But imagine if I'm talking about, Python code or something else, and I can't validate, when you're talking about thousands of lines of something or some SQL, and I don't know SQL, like, I have no way of validating this. So in my mind, we have to think now of ways to keep AI in the right direction and having some better ways of validating what AI does so that we can be confident in what it's doing. Because you get an answer. It's just confidently wrong sometimes.
An example of that is having an AI that changes or removes unit tests so that your code passes. That's what I've seen. It's like, oh, no, please don't do it.
There's many, many examples that we're seeing, and I don't know that anybody has an appreciation. Like at the leadership level, they don't necessarily have an appreciation for this because everybody sees the good and not necessarily the bad of AI.
I feel like we're all in this sort of Groundhog Day movie where we're sort of relearning the same things as an industry. You'll see like people that have never touched code discover Git and version control and tests. And I feel like your corollary of self-serve analytics is pretty on point there. There's a lot of that same behavior and sort of incentive there, and the same problems we're seeing here as well. You mentioned the naming of the modeling. I recall reading a article from Fast MCP, right? Like the biggest guys out there when it comes to MCP and Python, and they were talking about if you want to write a good MCP, it has to have at most like 10 or 50 things it does, and the name should say what the outcome is. All right, and it sort of reminds me of what you're describing here, right? Like it almost feels like this is the way a human would be able to interpret it, but it helps the AI as well, and it just runs a lot better.
You're trying to eliminate the guesswork, right? You're trying to direct it in the right way, and so like it's really interesting because I showed somebody like on my project where I took. I did a demo. I think it was using Cortex code, but either one, Cloud code would do the same, right? And it was like load Singapore data for the last 30 days, weather data for the last 30 days. And so it did it perfectly because I have an agent's MD. I had, like folder names that made sense. I had examples of other load scripts so it followed. Like I was using UV so that it would like essentially create that virtual environment on the fly with just the dependencies. And I was using DLT. So like it did it perfectly because it had something else to base it on. It didn't just invent everything. And then I said, okay, now I want you to make a data mart that does A, B, C, whatever. And not only did it know to do that, but it knew that I have a staging model first. So my first layer was staging. So it knew it had to do that before it got to the mart. And, like it knew that I had YAML files with descriptions. And so like it was following the patterns that were established in the repo and in the read in the agents MD and skills and all that kind of stuff that like, because I had all of that, then it was flawless, but if I don't have any of that, then it's just going to make things up and it may not necessarily do things right. I've seen it where like another one is where it will do something, but using an old way of doing something. Like it was trained on old data, right? And you're like, that's not how you would do this in DBT 110. Maybe in DBT 1.5, I would have done it that way. So it's like little things like that also I see become a problem.
Yeah, which highlights what you mentioned at the beginning, which is having already really good examples in your repository, working with a tool that has been built with scale from the beginning, and just telling AI, hey, whatever I'm doing, just replicate the exact exam process.
And you don't even have to tell it, like because it has the guardrails, right? Like when you do this, profile the data, then do this and do that. Like if what we're doing is teaching AI what we know, right? Like so we're imparting that knowledge as part of the context so that it is more likely to get it right. I still don't believe that you can. I still think you need some people to validate some of this stuff, but I look at it as like it's an efficiency play. So it's not about eliminating somebody; it's about making somebody more efficient. So if we think about another example is GPS, right? So before there was GPS, people read maps and there were books, and then you say like, I want to go to this location, and you find the city and the streets, whatever, and then you kind of like map this whole thing out. And then we have GPS on the phone. The process didn't change. Like I'm still going from place to place, but now I don't need to worry about like where I'm located because I have GPS to tell me where I am. I've put the location where I'm going. There are maps that do all of that. But if you remember when like Apple Maps came out and all this stuff, there would be like stories about like somebody drove into a lake because the GPS told them to go that way, and it's like, but that's what's happening with AI, right? Like I can't just trust it. I have to have some common sense and I have to validate what it's telling me. But if I do that, then it is making me more efficient because it saved me 70 or 80% of the work. And I'm just reviewing. I'm guiding it first, like this is what I need you to do. And then I'm validating that it followed my instructions and it would do things in the way that I would do them, right? Or somebody with more experience.
Thinking a lot about the extensions that arise out of something that you're describing here. There's a couple of things that you see happen in the industry as a whole, right? I guess, first of all, if you are more efficient, a lot of companies might make the decision to do it with leaner teams, and especially on the junior side, where you would typically kind of push off sort of this more menial work that is valuable, but not necessarily something you want to invest your time in if you can have AI do it for you. And on the other hand, if you do that, then maybe in 4 or 5 years, you don't have those experts to give those examples and build that knowledge into your AI system as you're describing. And it always strikes me that people don't really look at how these models have been developed. Like if you look at how are they even able to create all of these amazing things. Obviously, they're trained on all the human knowledge and all the data out there, but there's a whole process of post-training that happens where there's like thousands of people going over Q&As and saying like, okay, I like this answer best based on these 4 check marks, right? And what do you think the future is, if companies decide to go this direction? Because there's obviously financial pressure, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and there's just outside of AI, just a ton of pressure on bottom line of companies. What do you think we're sort of waiting for in the data industry in a couple of years?
This is an interesting one because it gets into the society, the impact on society of these technologies, right? So if we think about when you went from agricultural to the industrial revolution, there were good and bad things that came out of that, right? And then there was sort of like a pushback from society to say like, okay, we need worker protections, right? We need things that make sense, like people shouldn't work 7 days a week or so many hours in the day, and so that's when you have unions and that pushback, that rebellion came out of the capitalists having so much power over the people. And we're there again. I think we're at the beginning of that again. And so I think it's going to be interesting because like I'm a technologist. I appreciate it, right? But I also can appreciate the negative, the good and the bad, right? That comes with these things. So you'll see like, okay, now you have all these data centers and they're polluting water. And so it's like, okay, how are we going to deal with that? Because it's not necessarily about us. It's our grandchildren, right? Or people in the future. And so I think there's bigger implications that we haven't really dealt with yet, I think. And it's going to be interesting to see because it's like you sort of like, I always talk to people about systems optimization. If you look at an organization, when you have a project, you usually just optimize that part of the project, regardless of what's happening around you. And so you do local optimization versus system optimization, right? The system means I would optimize multiple things, and maybe it's not optimal for that one process, but across all of the processes is optimal, right? Because there's many things to consider. And so I think in here, we're getting to that same point where like we're optimizing so much for one area at the expense of, environment or society, right? And then it comes back to hurt you because then it's like, oh, now you have higher expenses in society expenses like homelessness or healthcare or all of these things, people that can't support themselves. And so like what we did is we optimized for one area at the expense of another area. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the world takes care of this kind of thing, because you see different countries doing different things. I mean, it's the same thing that happens also with personal data, right? If you look at like how personal data is treated in Europe versus in a lot of the US, it's a very big difference, right? And so that's what I think will need to change, but we'll have to see how it goes. And like you said, like how do you get, if you're only relying on AI, how do you get people who don't have the experience to get good enough to evaluate the AI? So it's just AI evaluating AI. Now you get into the matrix type of thing. Sorry.
That's another interesting angle to break this down. Maybe we're just a few months or a few years away from AI becoming very expensive and companies realizing it's cheaper to hire juniors than to token vaccine. So there is this.
In some research where the graph of the AI agents overtaking even the senior engineer in some regions. Yeah.
This internet theory that I saw that kind of broke my heart, that there is like a cursed generation. Like, I forgot what were the years, but there is a range of like 3 years that if you were born in those years, your parents probably struggled around the '08 crisis. You either had prom or the first years of university when we were in lockdown, and now you enter a job market where like nobody's hiring juniors. But maybe it's just that generation. And I'm sorry if somebody listening is from those years. Maybe it can course correct a little bit if indeed token maxing and the pricing just kind of makes it again unfeasible to fully automate a lot of tasks, at least from a monetary perspective.
I don't know. I don't think it's stoppable. Like, I don't think you can, right? It's like saying you're going to take people who move to the cities to work in factories to then go back and work in a farm, right? It doesn't happen, right? You only go forward. and so like, it's something else that needs to happen that we don't know yet. But I don't think it's saying that junior engineers, like, they're going to hire more of those, because even if it's more expensive, I can still do more. I can do more with it's more efficient, right? So what I talk to people about is, you can't just tell me what the AI did. I didn't hire you to just tell me what the AI told you, right? Because then I could have done it myself, right? And so what we need to get people to do is to think, right? To say like, okay, AI is telling me this. Does that make sense? What other things, how should I direct it, right? So you become more of a conductor, and you're getting people to like learn better ways of working, or even challenge the AI, right? To like, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Right. And so like, that's where you want the human to get to. But I don't know that you get to say like, I'm going to go from AI to junior engineers, because even if it's more expensive today, I mean, all of these companies are fighting, there's so much money and everything in there. They're like, I don't know that you're going to go back to the way it used to be.
No, it's just, and I also don't know what will happen. It's just a funny angle to think that it's also possible that it's not a straight line. But you actually brought up a really important point that I wanted to mention, and that is, I do agree with you, Noel, that some people feel like intermediaries, just like vomiting literally what AI says, and like, why do I even need you in the middle of the chain? Versus some people that really know how to leverage that. Can I actually ask you to phrase that a little bit more into career advice? Imagine you are just you're just learning how to work with AI. What is your advice for those people that truly want to like be in control of AI instead of just intermediate that is not bringing too much value?
If we're focusing on data, there are things that you should learn about regardless of who's doing the work, right? So what's changing is who's doing the work. It was me, and now it's AI. But in either case, I should have some clue of what I'm doing, right? So I should know what Kimball modeling is, or data vault, or what is change data capture, or what is Git, and why would I use Git, and what are good patterns of branching strategies? Why do I need pre-commit hooks? Or I focus more on the why and the how versus on the who is doing the work, right? Because the who is what's changing, but the why is where you need the person to essentially direct the AI. So I'll give you an example. Anyone will always show you like, okay, I'm going to have AI like make an application to do X. And they'll do it at different levels, right? And maybe you get it, go to few iterations, okay? But none of them talk about like, did the AI use the right design system so that whenever I add a new button, it doesn't pick a different color, right? Like, I have a way of like defining the colors in one place, right? So that my code is dry, that it's easy, that only comes from experience and knowing that that's a better pattern, right? So you have the people who are just sort of like the naive Gen AI users, which can get something done, but how well it scales or how well it survives, right, is questionable, because you're really just doing that self-service analytics thing, right? So self-service analytics, I just did something and I gave you the report and all of that. But in a year, I have 1,000 of these things and I don't know what anything means, versus saying like, okay, I know I'm going to need this metric multiple times. Let me put it in the DBT model. So then I could just leverage it in multiple dashboards, right? So that's where I tell people, learn the how things are done, and because those rules don't change, right? These are like the fundamental rules that I call them the data truths, right? Doesn't matter what you change. There's always more data. There's always data ingestion. There's always data quality issues. There's always ownership, right? There's a lot of these things that don't change. And so focus on that, because AI doesn't fix a bad ownership, right? A decision. Who has to make a decision? A lot of the time, even like when the developer's doing the work, the developer doesn't know how to make the decision. They just don't have enough context or something like that. Like if I have data that I'm ingesting some data and it has some PII data, I don't know which fields, and what are the rules of the company and different levels of data security. So those are things that are external to the AI that somebody needs to learn and understand, so that they can direct, or at least set up those guardrails for the AI. Because that's the other thing, right? You still need that.
Interesting. So it's kind of like AI accidentally promoted you from implementator into manager, designer, or architect. And most of the advice that you just gave is like how to be a good architect or a good manager or a good designer. And
like a good product manager. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, it's like a general contractor if you're making a house, right? You don't have to be the electrician and the plumber, the painter, right? But you need to know like how to sequence them and how to evaluate multiple proposals to see like, should we go with this person or that person,
Cool take.
What I'm getting from this, I just have a flashback from training junior engineers at the start of their career, and I was always trying to predict like who's gonna like have a easier or harder time picking things up, right? Like let's say we have 4 or 5 junior engineers, we're training them, let's see what happens in 2 years. So if the same amount of time, same effort, and oftentimes what I would find is the ones that struggled the most were the ones that didn't ask questions in general. Like they were not curious enough about how things work, why they work. Could it be even done better? I think you illustrated this in your story. Like you were having a data platform, you're like, it's not quite to my standard yet. But you had that standard, you had that drive, you had sort of that intuition of this is what it could look like. And I think that doesn't change with AI. Like I think sort of the way I look at it, it's like wisdom, it's taste, whatever you want to call it. You have to sort of fight that urge of instant gratification of, look, I pushed something. Here's another feature. Here's more volume. Here's more stuff. To saying, okay, that's all nice, but can we do better? And I guess what I would tell to anyone that's a junior now coming on the market is if you focus on doing that really well for long enough, you will find a place where that's appreciated. Where that is, who knows? Depending on where the market goes, but there's always going to be a demand for that. I mean, even if you look at the code or the data models that AI generates, it's sort of like it's all right, but there's always things you can pick on, right? You're like, well, that's good, but what about the governance? Or well, that's good, but what about performance? And then it's sort of like this average representation of what a data model would be, but not necessarily a good one. It requires a lot of your input to go from okay to great. And I don't know, that's
the issue that people don't appreciate yet because we're not far along in it is that what you're doing when you're not caring about that stuff, right? When you only focus on delivering fast, you're creating a lot of technical debt. And then it becomes like, oh, my warehouse bill, my data warehouse bill, it keeps going up, right? Exponentially. And now it's like, oh, now I need to go focus on that. But it's like, but you shouldn't have had that problem, right? If you started the other way. So I talk to people about like, there's two types of leaders, right? There's the ones who are just focused on like quick wins. Let's just do something, whatever. We'll just get something out there. And so they move fast at the expense of long-term, moving slow. So they move fast now, but then they move slow later. Where I say to people, you have to flip that around. You go a little bit slower now to go a lot faster forever, right? Because the conventions, those things that we were talking about earlier, like you said that once, and now it's like, I do this with people like in 6 weeks. We figure out the CI/CD. Are we going to do blue-green deployments? Are we going to do how we're going to do the security model in Snowflake? All sorts of things, right? It doesn't have to take a year. It didn't take that long in the grand scheme of things, but it's for people to at least have the conversations. Like I've had the met with teams and they're like, oh, we hadn't thought about that. Or, like, what are you going to do when this happens? DBT is a perfect example. So people starting with DBT, they don't realize that like DBT only creates things. It doesn't ever get rid of anything. And so then they end up with orphaned models in production, right? Like that's a very common thing where it's like I rename something or I remove something. It's still in the data warehouse because nobody deleted it. So I tell them, okay, this is what's going to happen. This is what you need to do, and then here are the implications. Like you can't have something like, so what we do is we have a macro that goes and just drops anything that's not in the repo, right? So like the repo is your source of truth. But that has another caveat, which is only DBT can be writing those models, right? If you have some other tool out there that DBT doesn't have the code for, then it's going to get dropped also. So again, you have to understand these kinds of things. And I don't know that people have that appreciation. And, and that's when we were talking about like where people move to, like having that curiosity to me, building that common sense, like the why are you doing this stuff? Like not just do it, but like, why am I doing it? And another good example is when people talk about like, I'm going to just have one big table. So I'm going to take whatever sources are and I'm just going to make one big table and it's going to have 500 columns. Okay. But then how does that impact your Gen AI, right? Or your tokens? And like, you have to like be thinking about multiple perspectives at once. And if you're only focusing on delivery, you're not thinking ahead. You're not thinking what is the North Star? Where am I heading to long term? Another example that I use is light. Okay. So we take for granted that any of us could go to the wall and hit a switch and light turns on. It's amazing, right? Like we said, like we can't even think about the fact that like it had to be generated somewhere. It had to be transmitted. It had to be transformed. That, like all of these things had to be perfectly working, right? And deal with like spikes in usage, right? And so many things have to go right so that we can have this call right now. Right? we wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't be even, if we don't have a stable power grid, we're not talking about Gen AI or any of this other stuff. But we're taking for granted that didn't just happen by magic, right? It took a lot of people to think about this stuff, to think about resiliency, to think about, power spikes and on. And like all of these things had to be developed over years so that now we can hit a switch and light turns on. So.
Both of you made me realize something, and that is we're maybe heading to this dystopian future where the most important part of an interview, whenever you were applying as a programmer, could be a personality test. Because it seems that we somehow agree that there are certain psychological tests that indicate that you're going to be a better AI user. And we talk about things like intellect, curiosity, but maybe the need for having things clean. I don't know the list, but if you're a psychologist listening to this, do some research, because if you're the first one to develop that interviewing technique, there is some big money in there.
Yeah, and I bet existing personality tests might be able to tell you something, right? There's that DISC assessment. I don't know if you've heard about it, but anyway, DSIC. And you answer all these questions, and at the end, you end up with a personality trait. And then you have the people who are just like, you just want to do something, right? The disruptors. But then you have the people who are more like, they're very thoughtful and are thinking long term and all of that. And I think it's always a mix. Like it's not like all one direction or all the other direction. But But yeah, having curiosity, I think, is definitely a huge thing. Like when we had COVID and they were saying like we can't find COBOL programmers. I don't know if you heard like during the COVID, right? I'm like, I've never seen COBOL, you know. Let me go learn a little bit about it. And I'm like, this is really interesting. And then it reminded me of SQL and all of that stuff. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I can kind of see like, okay, it was kind of for business, you know. And so like, it's interesting. Like, I don't have to like say like I'm a COBOL programmer, but I at least know enough to have an appreciation to like how that was developed.
I would say personality is one way to describe it, but I mean, it's funny. Like somewhere in your conversation, you mentioned you develop some common sense. I would rephrase that as wisdom, or like a crude battle scars, so to speak. I'm personally now learning how to golf, right? And like I wouldn't go and have an AI tell me like, oh, like to train me to become a good golfer. No, like why would I pay a coach or a teacher? Because they can point me right to the point that I need to focus on to like triple or quadruple my progress. And that's what I'm like paying for. And I think that's a similar thing if you're new coming onto the job market and you're trying to like put yourself out there. If you're more experienced, or even if you're a SaaS company or a platform, I mean, that's the main reason why that will not go away. I think I see all these articles like there's a SaaS apocalypse and there's not going to be a place for all these companies. I'm like, cool. But they thought about what is like the essential features that people need, because they were in a world where implementation was very expensive. So everything they built was very, very, very carefully curated. Whereas now I can just like turn on the fire hose and do whatever, and often end up in like a really weird place.
There's an article. I don't know if you know this company, Basecamp. And it's the people who put Ruby on Rails. They have an article, Start with No. Okay. So I remember I was doing this application. It was for vendor onboarding and all of that stuff. And we did all of these workshops to figure out the features and prioritize releases, all of that kind of stuff. And I tell people like there were a bunch of stuff that were just never done. Okay. And what would happen is the business person I was working with at the time, people would go to her. It's like, oh, we must have this feature to do this. And I sent her that article and I said, like, just whatever it is, whatever they're asking for, just say no. Because if it is very important, it'll keep coming up, right? It's not just from one person. It'll come from multiple people, because that feature, you have to look at it as like, it isn't just doing that feature for that person. It is that now that feature you have to maintain forever and ever, right? Like it's very hard to now say, I'm going to remove this thing that only one person in the whole company is using it, right? Or and there's testing and regression, like unit testing, all of that. Like, so by saying yes, I committed myself to this long, like life cycle of this thing that maybe nobody actually needed. And that's where, like, to me, the AI thing is like, if I can let somebody do self-service and do AI and it's a throwaway, whatever. But if they start relying on this and more people start relying on that stuff, that's when like that needs to shift over to something that is more governed and better. And so like, how do people make that distinction? I think that's still going to be very hard, and people are going to learn over time, like I said, when their data warehouse bills goes up, when things are failing all over the place and nobody knows how any of the code works, like there's going to be an inflection point where people will appreciate these things that I'm talking about, but we're not there yet because it just hasn't happened enough, right? Like I said, the Industrial Revolution, nobody cares that like one person is falling off a building over here or running over by a forklift over there. But if it happens many, many times, you're like, oh my God, we have to do something about this, right? This is not good.
Yeah, so another piece of advice you just gave us is, for anybody, if you're in a centralized data team, check what type of AI products are gaining traction internally and, well, maybe rebuilding them, but properly from the beginning and make it scalable. That could be a really interesting use of your time.
And that's why you need the people who are curious, who are asking the questions. We were talking earlier about like, who are the good people that you can, like the people who ask questions. And I think it's the same thing. So like, I'm not asking questions of a human, but I'm asking questions of the AI. Like, why did you make that decision? But is there a better way? What are my options? What is Kimball modeling? What is Data Vault? What are the pros and cons of each? Like somebody has to care about that versus just saying like, I don't know, just make this thing into a dashboard. Done. I don't care.
For the people listening in that are saying, yes, I want to work with Noel, where can they find you? What are you working on? Where can people find you online?
I think the biggest thing is LinkedIn. If you go to LinkedIn and search for Noel Gomez, I think my LinkedIn is, I don't know, it's / Noel Gomez, I think. But anyway, I post about a lot of things in there. Next week, I don't know when this is going to be published, but I'll be at the Snowflake conference, and then I'll be at the DBT conference in September. So, find me in any of those places. I'm always happy to talk to people, even like, I'm not a salesperson, a marketing person. So sometimes, people meet with me and they're like, oh, this was a good conversation. You weren't just showing me slides, and I'm like, because I care, I'm more passionate about this stuff. So I'm always looking to meet people in this space and have these kinds of conversations, because I enjoy it, not just because I'm trying to sell something.
Nice. I will see you definitely at the DBT one.